Welcome along to another episode of KNTV. Today I chat with Dan Morrice, author of Finding the Peacemakers, a fascinating book full of amazing stories of people's faith in God. So Dan, welcome to KNTV.
Thank you very much.
Finding the Peacemakers, what a book.
No, thank you.
How does a humble geography teacher in Bristol end up meeting people from all over the world?
Basically, the beginning was, I suppose, I always say curiosity was my sort of fuel. Yeah. I'd read the story of the Chilean miners. Then, lots of people remember that. It was a long time ago now, but I think it sticks in people's memory as one of those really remarkable stories that ended well. We don't have many of those stories. It was a real disaster. The sort of initial reports of a collapse and their survival, no one thought they'd survive, was very gloomy. And so, after 2 weeks, everyone thought, they're all dead basically. So then on day 17, when they found them all alive and well, it was such a remarkable moment. I think the whole world just went, this is a story that started badly and ended well. It's normally the other way around. And so by that point, the media was all committed and they were following this good news story and they got out. And the whole way through, at any second, their mind could have collapsed and they've all been crushed. So the fact that at every stage, it felt like there was some kind of providence that kept them going. And so I loved the story. I loved the fact it ended well. I loved the sort of brotherhood the men formed underground in terms of sort of peacemaking, and there's a real sort of forgiveness culture. Because some guys stole the emergency rations on day 1, for example. So on day 17, when you're down to half a teaspoonful of tuna a day per man, that's pretty bleak, but they would stay like, no, all is forgiven, and they're learning to, and they're very honest before God. They would get down on their knees and pray forgiveness for moments of fracture in the mind or things they've done in their life. It was just a real humble spirit. And then the sort of, almost the miracles that saved them. The drill went off course by itself, a breeze that swept up and restored the guy's breathing in his last moments. So the whole story was just full of amazing bits. And so I wrote to one of the miners. As a long shot, I was just a guy that wrote a letter via his publisher, say, could you forward it on? And by God's grace, it landed on his doorstep. And he wrote back and said, call me when you land. So it was like, really? So I went along with it, and I met Jose, and he introduced me to other miners, and the whole thing snowballed.
So Dan, what do you think motivated you to contact one of the miners? Because let's face it, we all heard that amazing story, but we didn't all write a letter or an email. So what was it you think that motivated you to do that?
I think I had a real desire, because I was a teacher at the time, and I used to do the odd assembly and that kind of thing, and I really wanted to inspire the young people in my school. So I thought, out of a desire to give my students some role models, I pursued this story. And then fortunately it kind of got bigger, and I'm like, well, it became more than a school assembly. So, as the doors kept opening, I kept going.
So Dan, I'm really interested in the title of the book, because as you say, it's all about good news stories. So you could have gone with something along those lines, but instead you went with Finding the Peacemakers. Tell us about that.
Well, credit to my editor, Jess, because that was actually her idea. And like a lot of authors, you have a script in mind, you have all these stories, but actually when it goes to the stage of editing, someone else says, hang on a second, I think there's a different narrative going on here. So that was her idea, and it's a brilliant idea. I hadn't seen it at all. I'd actually been telling these stories, which were all really about peacemaking. I just hadn't seen that golden thread. So when Jess suggested that, I thought, that is exactly it. I kind of canned my idea. And because all the stories had an element of peacemaking, but it wasn't necessarily, the stories are very different, from Chilean miners to Syrian refugees to English football hooligans. You could seem like these are very different stories from different cultures, different communities, different sort of conflicts even. But actually all of the sort of unsung heroes that I was writing about either were overcoming adversity with that sort of sublime peace that passes all understanding, or they were really practicing peace in terms of reaching out to their enemies or people from the supposed other tribe. Often it could be race, religion, it could be just a different political group. There's people, and this is sort of exaggerated in the sort of social media echo chambers, people hear about that other group. The problems of the world is them. But actually it takes a brave person to go to the them and build a friendship and realise it's just another human being And if I'd been raised in their subculture, I could be exactly the same as them. You know, they're just a friend who happens to be on the other side of a line. So looking back on the book now, I can see how clear it is that it should be about peacemaking. But at the time, I felt like God was just leading me step by step. And then, as those stories came together, the grand narrative that he knew all along, but took me a long time to come up with. And it, like I say, it wasn't even me that came up with it. It was Jess who said, I think this book's about peacemaking. I'm like, oh, yes, of course it is.
So Dan, you mentioned walking step by step after Jesus, and that quite literally meant going through a desert. So why did you do that, and what was it like?
Well, there's two answers to that. One, I didn't cope at all. I made every rookie error in the book, and so I often say there's two types of explorers. There's the Bear Grylls types, who know what they're doing. You know, they've got some experience, they're hard, and then there's the Bilbo Baggins types who are on an adventure, almost by accident. They don't know what they're doing. They're totally out of their depth. They're looking around thinking, you know, this is the long way from home. And I was definitely the latter. And so, I made lots of rookie errors. I took the wrong boots. I took too much kit. I got lost. I ran into wolves, you know, all the things that I wasn't expecting. But in terms of the reason why, because I think, you know, the why is the interesting bit sometimes. Why did you walk across a desert? As I often ask myself on a daily basis when I was there. All the stories in the book, other than sort of peacemaking, that was the sort of golden thread. But the sort of fuel, the motivation, the inspiration behind the peacemakers was their faith in Jesus. They weren't just like trying to be nice for the sake of it. I mean, most people don't have that strength within them. I certainly don't. To be nice on a daily basis. I'm far too selfish. But actually they'd known a real piece of God, way beyond human resources. And that came from their faith in Jesus. And I wanted to kind of capture his story as the original peacemaker. So that's what I did. I thought I'll start with his earthly life, and then I'll see on that journey whether I can unpack a little bit more about what he ended up saying and doing. I experienced what he experienced. Obviously, a lot easier. I was older, I had more kits, I could Google the route, which he couldn't do. But we both walked on our own 2 feet, and I wanted to experience that sort of rawness of the desert that he would have experienced walking from Egypt all the way to Nazareth.
Wow. Did you have to put aside your kind of geography teacher while you were doing that, looking around at all the sand and everything, and just try and think more spiritually, exactly. Or was it all kind of intertwined?
So, yeah, absolutely. I'd say as a geography teacher, I should have known better in many finding water. I'm like, it's the rainy season, so I'll just get water from, streams in the desert. There were no streams in the desert. So, yeah, made lots of rookie errors.
So stories from all over the world in the book, but one that was close to home, in fact, in your home city of Bristol, about the football hooligans. Yeah. So tell us about them.
I'd actually met Dave as a teacher, and so he came to do an assembly. He was chaplain of Bristol Rovers at the time, and I was just a geography teacher, and it was one of those assemblies where you sort of file all the students in, and the head will say some inspiring words, and then you'll applaud the team that won sports day, and and there'll be a guest speaker to say something about working hard. And I think no one was quite prepared for Dave. It was just, and he's a real gentle soul. He's a real sort of peaceful character. And so when he stepped up to share his story, and then he shared a lifetime of real violence, everyone was like, "Oh right, that is not, it's not what you're expecting on, like a Monday afternoon." And real fear and hatred. Like, he was a very troubled soul. And then when you see the journey he went on to the man he's become now, it is a remarkable turnaround. And so Dave had become a Christian. I'd say that it's important to say there's a couple of unsung heroes. I always say there's a hero behind the hero. So for Dave in particular, one was his mum. So his mum had become a Christian as well. She's a real sort of role model in Bristol. She had started the charity 125. It's rescuing street sex workers in Bristol and done a lot of work with the homeless. And she had been a real pioneer in reaching out to broken people in Bristol. But, one of those broken people was her son, and she had been praying and grafting, and she really believed that God was going to rescue Dave way before Dave did. He was like, nah, not me, mate, no. But actually, when he came to faith, she was like, I knew it. So she had been a real sort of role model in his life. Often these stories have an extra element where, your past comes to catch up with you, as it were. So he met one of the old gang rivals in hospital, actually. His son had been in hospital, and, I can't share all the details, but he met him there on a ward. And just kind of clocked him like, oh, that's Divvy. And Dave was Bristol Rovers back in the day, and Divvy was one of the Bristol City lads. And Divvy didn't know, but Dave is now a vicar. And so Dave was like, I don't want to engage. But he just felt like God say, look, you need to go over and chat to him. So he went over to Divvy and was like, you right, mate? And Divvy was like, you're right, mate. Sort of, they couldn't square out to each other because one's a vicar and the other guy's in a hospital bed, but they still put on a bit of facade. And, they got chatting, and then Dave shared, I'm a minister now. Divvy's like, you're a vicar, because could not believe the surprise. And I had a bit of a laugh about it and got chatting. And Divvy's thinking, this guy is, he's seen the change in Dave. He knew him as a kind of angry, chaotic, violent youth, and now he's this peaceful, gracious, strong vicar, ministering to him, and he's thinking, what's going on here? So Dave offered to pray for him, and Divvy was like, yeah, why not? It's his new territory. I've got this former rival who's now befriending me and offering to pray for me, and he's like, I'm in hospital, I'm sick, I'll receive prayer. And when Dave prayed for him, Divvy said he experienced this like electricity running through his body, just this warmth of love that was just completely like nothing he'd ever experienced before. And he said to Dave, what was that? And Dave was like, it's just the presence of God. And to cut a long story short, Divvy became a Christian, he got baptised, and Dave baptised him. And actually not long afterwards, Divvy died. He was terminally ill, and Dave led his baptism, he led his funeral, and in Divvy's final days, Dave was like the friend to him that he needed to, he needed that friend.
So Dan, I was wondering, from writing the book, were there any unexpected results for you personally?
But actually, when you step out and you really put yourself in God's hands and you're out of your depth and you're like, God, I really need you. Like day one, we had no water, So it's often prayer as a last resort. When you've got no other options, it's your first and last resort. And so I feel like I learned through really trusting God and really practicing faith and obedience when it was hard. I learned that God really is good. There was one particular moment I call it the valley of a shadow of death from Psalm 23, because it could have been, it literally could have been the valley that David was in when he was writing that psalm. And I'd left the map. I was following a sort of trail, but I had to take a shortcut. There was no signal in the valley. I was not on Google Maps. I wasn't on a physical map. I was kind of guessing where to go, and I ran into trouble. I reached it was actually like a sort of polished slab, like a little mini cliff face at the end of this ravine. And I couldn't get up, and I was running late. I was out of water, as I always am. It was getting cold in the valley. I'd run into wolves earlier in the day. The fear started to creep up, and I felt like I really needed God. And like I say, he wasn't going to parachute me out, and so I had to trust him. So I remember praying, okay, God, what do we do? And I started to climb this slab, and I felt like I could say really clearly, like, go back. Like, this is a terrible idea, And God in his grace sometimes opens doors, sometimes in his grace he closes doors, and it felt like really like, do not climb that slab. You're not Bear Grylls, you're not that good a climber, And so, but I didn't want to go back, because that's negative time. I'm going, I haven't got time to go back and retrace my steps. But anyway, I felt like it wasn't so much like he was stopping me in a kind of challenge. It was more of an invitation to trust me. It's like, just trust me, go back, I'll lead you. And so I went back, and I'm like almost praying my way through this valley, okay, left or right, following his leading. I felt like he said left. So I sort of navigated my way literally through prayer, and I got to this tiny little path. I would never have seen it on the way up, which kind of snaked up round the ridge and came up across this slab, and then kind of followed the trail up, and I got to safety. Wow. If I hadn't obeyed that little, still small voice, I could have fallen from that slab, and I wouldn't be here now. And so I guess for me, the big lesson, like you say, is that you can trust God. And sometimes that still small voice, it is worth obeying. And it's not always easy, but it's worth obeying.
Well, Dan, thank you so much
Thanks,
for
George.
joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.